The rancher's horse refused to drink from the new well, it knew a body was buried below. But that morning, when Elias Thorne first struck water after 13 months of backbreaking labor, he had no way of knowing the truth that lay beneath his boots. All he felt was the blessed relief of a man who had fought the desert and won. The drought had been merciless. For over a year, the sun had beaten down on his ranch like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil, turning the earth to dust and the creek beds to cracked scars across the land. Cattle had died. Neighbors had packed up and left. The bank had come calling twice, their city suits wilting in the heat as they reminded Elias of payments due. But he had refused to surrender. "Water's down there somewhere," he had muttered to himself each morning, hefting his pickaxe and shovel. "Just got to dig deep enough." And finally, at 43 feet down, his shovel had struck something different. Not the familiar thunk of packed clay or the scrape of stone, but a soft, yielding sound that made his heart leap. He had dropped to his knees, clawing at the earth with his bare hands until muddy water seeped between his fingers. "Dusty," he had called to his horse, his voice cracking with emotion. "We did it, old boy. We found her." The chestnut gelding had been his constant companion through the ordeal, standing patient guard as Elias descended into the earth each day. Dusty was no ordinary horse. In his 12 years, he had proven himself more reliable than most men Elias had known. The animal could sense a storm 3 days out, could find his way home in a blizzard, and had once saved Elias's life by refusing to cross a bridge that collapsed an hour later. So when Elias led his string of horses to the new well that first morning, expecting to see them drink their fill of the precious water, Dusty's reaction stopped him cold. The horse approached the well's stone rim, lowered his head toward the water, and then suddenly reared back as if he'd been struck by lightning. His nostrils flared wide, his eyes rolled white, and he let out a sound Elias had never heard before, a keening whinny that seemed to carry pain and terror in equal measure. "Easy, boy," Elias soothed, reaching for the lead rope. But Dusty backpedaled frantically, nearly trampling the other horses in his haste to get away from the well. "What's gotten into you?" The other horses, sensing Dusty's distress, began to shift nervously. But when Elias led them forward individually, they drank without hesitation. The water was clear, cool, and sweet. Only Dusty refused to go near it. "Stubborn old fool," Elias muttered, though worry gnawed at him. In all their years together, Dusty had never acted like this. "Must be the stress getting to you too." But as the days passed, Dusty's behavior grew worse, not better. The horse refused to enter the northern section of the corral where the well stood. When Elias tried to force the issue, Dusty would plant his hooves and tremble, sweat breaking out across his coat despite the early morning chill. More disturbing still, the horse had begun pawing at a specific spot near the well's base, always the same spot, until he had worn a shallow depression in the hard earth. "Marcus, I'm telling you, something's wrong with that well," Elias said one evening as his neighbor Marcus Blackwood helped him repair a section of fence. Marcus was a good man, one of the few who had stayed to fight the drought instead of running. He owned the spread to the east and had been invaluable during the well digging, helping Elias lay the final stones that lined the shaft. Marcus chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow. "Horses are funny creatures, Elias. Maybe he doesn't like the taste. Well water's different from creek water." "It's not the taste," Elias insisted. "He won't even go near it. And yesterday I caught him pawing at the ground again, right by the base of the well. Same spot every time. Could be he smells something down there. Dead prairie dog, maybe. You know how their tunnels run." Marcus hammered in another nail with practiced ease. "Or maybe the old boy's just getting senile. How old is he now? 12? 13? The suggestion stung more than it should have. "Dusty's not senile. He's got more sense than most people I know." "I'm not saying he doesn't, neighbor. Just that animals get strange ideas sometimes." Marcus straightened, studying Elias with eyes that seemed genuinely concerned. "You've been under a lot of stress this past year." Maybe you're reading too much into things. That night, alone in his cabin, Elias found himself staring out the window at the well. Moonlight silvered its stone rim, making it look like some ancient altar. A faint breeze stirred the dust, and for just a moment, he thought he caught a whiff of something unpleasant. Something that didn't belong. The next morning brought Sheriff Brody to his door, hat in hand and worry lines creasing his weathered face. "Morning, Elias. Mind if I come in? Got something I need to ask you about." They sat at Elias's kitchen table, sharing coffee that had been reheated too many times. The sheriff was a good man, but the drought had aged him. Too many desperate people, too many hard choices, too many families packing up their lives and leaving in the dead of night to avoid their debts. "I don't suppose you've seen anything of Jeremiah Abernathy?" the sheriff asked. "That land surveyor who was working the area a few months back." Elias searched his memory. Thin fellow. Wore spectacles. "I remember him stopping by in, what was it, March? April? April. He was doing some work for the territorial office, checking property boundaries and water rights. Seems he's gone missing. His wife back in Denver hasn't heard from him in months. Can't say I've seen him since that one time. He was asking about the old creek beds, where they used to run before they dried up." Elias frowned. "You think something happened to him?" Sheriff Brody shrugged. "Could be anything. Maybe he just decided to head for greener pastures like so many others. But his wife says he's not the type to just disappear without word. And his horse came back without him." "His horse came back?" "Found her wandering about 2 weeks ago, still saddled. No sign of Abernathy anywhere." The sheriff drained his coffee and stood. "If you see or hear anything, you let me know, will you?" After the sheriff left, Elias found himself drawn back to the well. Dusty stood in the far corner of the corral, as far from the stone structure as he could get while still remaining in the enclosure. When he saw Elias approaching, the horse nickered softly but didn't move closer. "What is it, boy?" Elias asked quietly. "What do you know that I don't?" As if in answer, a gust of wind swirled up from the well's depths, carrying with it that same faint, sour smell he had noticed the night before. It was barely perceptible, gone as quickly as it came, but it made his stomach turn nonetheless. That afternoon, Elias climbed down into the well to inspect the stonework. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for his shoulders, and the darkness seemed to press against him like a living thing. He lit a lantern and lowered it on a rope, examining each level of carefully fitted stones. Most of the work was solid, the stones fitted together with the patience of a man who knew his craft. But there was one section, about halfway down, where the work looked different. Hasty. The stones didn't fit as tightly, and the mortar between them was a slightly different color. It was subtle, he might never have noticed it if he hadn't been looking for something wrong. "Marcus helped me with this section," he murmured to himself, remembering. It had been late in the day, and they had been eager to finish before dark. Marcus had mixed the mortar while Elias selected stones, and they had worked quickly to complete that level. But why would Marcus do shoddy work? It didn't make sense. The man was as meticulous as they came. Unless he had been in a hurry for some other reason. The thought came unbidden, and Elias tried to push it away. Marcus was his friend, his neighbor. He had been nothing but helpful throughout the ordeal of digging the well. But as Elias climbed back to the surface, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That evening, he rode over to Marcus's spread. His neighbor was mending tack in his barn, working by lamplight. "Elias. Good to see you. How's that well treating you?" "Well enough." Elias studied his friend's face in the flickering light. "Marcus, when we were laying those stones that last day, do you remember anything unusual?" Marcus looked up from the bridle he was repairing. "Unusual how?" "I don't know. Maybe a smell. Something that didn't seem right?" For just a moment, Marcus's hands stilled on the leather. Then he resumed his work with a chuckle. Can't say I do. We were working pretty fast, as I recall. Wanted to get finished before dark. He glanced up. Why? You're not still worrying about that horse of yours, are you? Maybe I am. Elias. Marcus set down his tools and faced him squarely. You've been through hell this past year. We all have. Sometimes when a man's been pushed to his limits, he starts seeing things that aren't there. Maybe you should talk to Doc Hendricks, get something to help you sleep. My sleep's fine. Is it? You look like you haven't had a good night's rest in weeks. Marcus's voice was gentle, concerned. Look, if it'll put your mind at ease, why don't I come over tomorrow and we'll take another look at that well together? Check the stonework, make sure everything's sound. Elias nodded, though he couldn't say why the offer made him more uneasy instead of less. All right. I'd appreciate that. But as he rode home under the star-filled sky, he made a decision. He wouldn't wait for Marcus. Tonight, he would find out what Dusty knew. He waited until well past midnight before making his move. The moon was dark, providing perfect cover as he gathered his tools, a crowbar, a pickaxe, a shovel, and a hooded lantern. He moved quietly, not wanting to spook the horses, but Dusty sensed his presence anyway. The gelding stood at the corral fence, ears pricked forward, watching as Elias approached the well. Easy, boy, Elias whispered. We're going to find out what's down there. Descending into the well by lamplight was like entering a tomb. The stone walls seemed to close in around him, and every sound echoed strangely in the confined space. He positioned himself at the section of questionable stonework and began to carefully remove the mortar with his crowbar. The work was slow and nerve-wracking. Each scrape of metal on stone seemed impossibly loud in the silence. But gradually, the stones began to loosen. As he pried the first one free, a wave of putrid air rushed out from the space behind it, so foul that he had to climb up for fresh air before continuing. When he returned, he worked faster, driven by a mixture of dread and determination. More stones came free, revealing a cavity behind the well's wall. He held his lantern close to the opening and peered inside. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his days. A canvas sack, stained dark with old blood, had been stuffed into the space behind the stones. Through a tear in the fabric, he could see the unmistakable curve of a human skull. Spectacles, their lenses long since shattered, lay beside what remained of Jeremiah Abernathy. Elias's hands shook as he climbed out of the well. Above ground, Dusty waited, his intelligent eyes reflecting the starlight. The horse stepped forward and gently nuzzled Elias's shoulder, as if offering comfort. You knew, Elias whispered, his voice hoarse with shock. You knew all along. But knowing what lay beneath his well was only half the horror. The other half was the terrible certainty of who had put it there. Only one person had been in a position to conceal a body during the well's construction. Only one person had access, opportunity, and the knowledge of masonry needed to wall up that grisly secret. Marcus Blackwood. His neighbor. His friend. The man who had helped him survive the drought. A murderer. Elias forced himself to think clearly. He needed evidence. He needed proof. Most importantly, he needed to stay alive long enough to see justice done. If Marcus suspected that his secret had been discovered. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made his blood freeze. Through the darkness, he could make out a rider approaching at a steady canter. Even before the man came close enough to identify, Elias knew who it was. Marcus rode with a distinctive posture, slightly forward in the saddle, and his horse had a particular gait. Elias? Marcus called out as he approached. That you by the well? Saw your light from my place. There was no time to hide what he had done. The stones lay scattered around the well's base, and his tools were still in plain sight. Elias's mind raced as he tried to think of an explanation. Couldn't sleep, he called back, trying to keep his voice steady. Thought I'd check on that loose stonework we talked about. Marcus dismounted and walked closer, his own lantern casting dancing shadows. Find anything interesting? The question was casual, but there was something underneath it that made Elias's skin crawl. A watchfulness. Attention. Loose stones, like I thought, Elias said. Going to need some work. Is that right? Marcus held his lantern higher, and Elias saw his eyes take in the scattered stones, the tools, the dark opening in the well's wall. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Marcus smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Elias had ever seen. You know, Elias, I was hoping we wouldn't have to have this conversation. Elias's hand moved slowly toward the pickaxe at his feet. What conversation would that be, Marcus? The one where I explain why you're going to have an accident tonight. A tragic fall down your own well. These things happen when a man works alone in the dark. Like what happened to Abernathy. Marcus's smile widened. Jeremiah Abernathy was a problem. Man came around asking too many questions about water rights, about who owned what. Started nosing around my property, checking old survey stakes. Found out I'd been diverting water from the main creek before it reached the other spreads. So you killed him. I defended my interests. Man's got a right to do that. Marcus began moving closer, and Elias saw the glint of a knife in his hand. See, during the drought, I needed every drop of water I could get. That little dam I built upstream kept my cattle alive while everyone else's died. Made it look like the creek just dried up natural-like. That's why there was no water downstream. You stole it. I took what I needed to survive. And I would have shared it, eventually. Once I was sure my own stock was safe. Marcus was only a few feet away now. But Abernathy threatened to report me. Said what I was doing was illegal. Well, maybe it was, but a man's got to do what he's got to do. Elias gripped the pickaxe handle. So you murdered him and stuffed him in my well. Your well was convenient. You were so focused on digging, you never noticed when I helped myself to some of your stones. Built him a nice little tomb, then helped you finish the job. Figured the water would wash away any unpleasantness. But Dusty knew. Animals can smell death. Marcus glanced toward the corral, where Dusty stood watching them with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. Smart horse. Too smart for his own good. Just like his owner. The attack came without warning. Marcus lunged forward with the knife, but Elias was ready. He swung the pickaxe in a wide arc, forcing Marcus to jump back. The two men circled each other in the flickering lamplight, death hanging in the air between them. You can't win this, Elias, Marcus panted. Even if you kill me, who's going to believe your story? You think anyone will take the word of a man who's been acting crazy for weeks? Elias said nothing, conserving his energy. He knew Marcus was right about one thing, this had to end decisively. There could be no survivors to spread different versions of the story. Marcus feinted left, then came in low with the knife. Elias brought the pickaxe down, but Marcus rolled aside and the tool struck sparks from the stone well rim. Before Elias could recover, Marcus was on him, knife flashing in the lamplight. They grappled at the edge of the well, both men fighting for their lives. Marcus was younger and stronger, but Elias had the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. The knife blade sliced across his forearm, and he felt blood running down to his hand, making his grip slippery. Just as Marcus seemed to gain the upper hand, pressing Elias back toward the well's mouth, a sound split the night air, the thundering of hooves. Dusty had somehow gotten out of the corral and was charging toward them, his hooves striking fire from the rocky ground. Marcus turned at the sound, and in that moment of distraction, Elias broke free. He dove aside as 1,200 pounds of furious horse slammed into Marcus, knocking him backward. The man's scream was cut short as he tumbled into the well, the sound of his impact echoing up from the depths. Elias lay gasping on the ground, blood flowing from his wound. Dusty stood over him protectively, sides heaving from his charge. In the sudden silence, the only sound was the distant splash of water far below. "Good boy," Elias whispered, reaching up to touch his horse's muzzle. "Good boy." Sheriff Brody arrived at sunrise, along with the doctor and half the town. Elias's story seemed impossible at first: the hidden body, the murdered surveyor, the neighbor who had turned killer. But the evidence was undeniable. Abernathy's remains, still clutching the survey papers that documented Marcus's illegal water diversion. Marcus himself, dead at the bottom of the well alongside his victim. They found the dam that afternoon, a carefully constructed barrier hidden in a narrow canyon upstream. When they destroyed it, water flowed again into the creek beds that had been dry for over a year. The drought was far from over, but now the remaining ranchers would have enough water to survive until the rains returned. "Damnedest thing I ever saw," Sheriff Brody said as they sealed the well with stones and mortar. "If it hadn't been for that horse of yours." Elias nodded, watching as Dusty grazed peacefully in the pasture. The horse had been calm ever since Marcus's death, as if some great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Animals know things we don't," Elias said simply. "We just have to be smart enough to listen." They buried Jeremiah Abernathy in the town cemetery with full honors. His wife came from Denver for the service, a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes. She thanked Elias for finding her husband, for giving her the closure she needed. "He was a good man," she said. "He would never have abandoned his work, no matter how difficult things got." As winter approached and the first snows began to dust the mountains, Elias stood by his cabin and looked out over his land. The well was gone, sealed forever, but he had found another source of water, a natural spring that bubbled up from deep underground, clear and sweet and untainted by death. Dusty approached and nuzzled his shoulder, and Elias reached up to scratch behind the horse's ears. "You saved us all, old friend," he said quietly. "You saved us all." The horse whickered softly and returned to his grazing, content in the knowledge that the evil buried beneath their feet had finally been brought to light. In the distance, water flowed again through creek beds that had run dry, carrying life back to a land that had known too much death. The drought would end eventually. It always did. But the bond between a man and his horse, forged in the crucible of those terrible months, would endure forever. Sometimes the most important truths came not from human wisdom, but from the ancient instincts of creatures who saw the world with clearer eyes. Sometimes, when the wind was right and the night was still, Elias thought he could hear the sound of water flowing underground, not the tainted water of the cursed well, but the clean, sweet water of the hidden spring that had always been there, waiting to be found. It was the sound of hope, of renewal, of life continuing despite the darkness that sometimes threatened to swallow it whole. And beside him always stood Dusty, faithful guardian and keeper of secrets, the horse who had known that death lay buried beneath their feet and had refused to let his master drink from that poisoned well. In a world where men could become monsters and neighbors could turn to killers, it was the animals, with their pure instincts and unshakable loyalty, who showed the way back to the light. The rancher's horse had refused to drink from the new well because it knew a body was buried below. And in the end, that knowledge had saved them all.